Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here on behalf of UNESCO. I'm glad to be able to contribute. My presentation will not be so sort of based on ground action, and maybe more on policy and tools that UNESCO has been developing in the past. Although, of course, there will be something that UNESCO could contribute to also the prevention and the protection. I want to focus on a tool that has been created recently that is called the Post-Disaster Needs Assessment, PDNA in short. And also I would link this to another new policy which is called the Warsaw Recommendation on World Heritage Reconstruction, adopted recently by the World Heritage Committee, and then I will explain how the two are related. And I think during my presentation you will see how this has also many connections with what has been said by, for example, Professor Simon and also by Brian Daniels just now. So the first thing that I would like to say is that in post-disaster situations, especially seen from the point of view of a UN agency, it's a time when all sectors engage, many agencies intervene, and there are many challenges for an organization like UNESCO to be able to fulfill its mandate, which is, of course, focusing on, for example, cultural heritage. And we have seen very clearly how it is important to fit into the system, as I think Brian just mentioned, to understand what are the practices, the regulations, the methodologies that are used by the larger humanitarian community, and fit within them and use the same terminology and approaches. And that's exactly what the PDNA for culture intends to do. The PDNA is something that was agreed by the UN system, the World Bank, and the European Union in 2008. There is an agreement that was signed. You see it here on the screen. It was a sort of reaction to the experience of the post-tsunami humanitarian response, the tsunami in South Asia of 2005. At the time, almost 300 humanitarian organizations fled to Indonesia, to Thailand, to provide their support, and a state of chaos sort of set in where no one knew exactly who was doing what. The national authorities were completely overwhelmed, and it became apparent that this could not go on like this, and that there was a need for a single approach and one entry point for the national authorities to deal with the international community and to benefit from their support. So this is the PDNA, Post-Disaster Needs Assessment, which has been then guiding the interventions of the UN and the European Union and World Bank ever since. Another point that I would like to make is that this, of course, deals with the so-called natural disasters, but there is a strong body of literature that has demonstrated how conflicts and disasters in reality are two phenomena that reinforce each other, because countries that have gone through long, protracted states of conflict then are much more vulnerable to natural disasters, and vice versa. Countries that have been affected by natural disasters are more exposed to the possibility of a conflict. In the UN system, there is something called Recovery and Peacebuilding Assessment, which is the sort of cousin of PDNA for disaster. And UNESCO, of course, works also in that context to mainstream the cultural dimension. That's for another maybe day. At what time does the PDNA is carried out? It is not the immediate humanitarian support. It's not about saving human life. It starts a few weeks after a major disaster, and then it ends when the actual recovery starts. It usually takes a few weeks and involves all UN agencies and many, many other partners like NGOs. For example, now we are doing one in Kerala, in India, in the state of Kerala, which was affected by major floods, and we're working with the ICROM and ICOMOS to help us assessing the damage caused by these floods to the cultural sector and to plan for the recovery. A little bit of historical background on where this PDNA is coming from. In the 1970s and 80s, the World Bank had developed its own methodology for assessing disaster damage and needs, and it was called ECLAC. It had a very strong focus on the economic dimension. Basically, the World Bank was looking at the physical assets, understanding what it would take to replace them, put a cost to it, and that was the end of the exercise. But since the rest of the UN became involved, then the human development aspect became integrated into the methodology. And then recently, in 2014, UNESCO also joined with a specific section on culture, which enriched further the methodology. So the culture chapter is now one of several chapters that can be found in the guidelines for PDNA, and which we use on a regular basis. We have done so far, since 2015, about 9 of these exercises. The key steps of any PDNA involves, of course, data collection, then the assessment of the effects of the disaster, then the translation of these effects into impacts, both at economic and human development level, and then, very importantly, the definition of the needs and the planning for recovery. You will see how this applies to the concerns of the culture sector in a moment. We have categorized the culture sector around 5 components. It could be done in different ways, and in fact, whenever we do a PDNA in each given country, we adjust this methodology to the specificities of the local context. But basically, we have agreed that we have the built heritage, we have the movable heritage with the buildings that housed these collections. We have repositories of heritage that are buildings that are not significant from a cultural point of view in themselves, but house important valuable items such as archives, libraries, but even the infrastructure of ministries of culture, Department of Antiquities, theaters, dance schools, and the rest. We have intangible cultural heritage, the practices, the skills, the knowledge that define the cultural identity of a community. And very importantly, we also include cultural and creative industries. For example, in the state of Kerala in India, this is probably the most affected part of our PDNA for culture. The challenge that we face in the culture sector, as I mentioned, is that we often do not have reliable data. Contrary to other sectors which are more established, like, for example, health or housing or education, where they have lots of data about what is there before a disaster. For us, it's always a bit of a challenge. We conduct these assessments around 4 key dimensions. And here again, I'd like to stress the innovation of PDNA with respect to the traditional approach to cultural heritage damage assessment. The 4 dimensions are, on the top of the slide, the most obvious one, the assessment of total or partial destruction of physical assets. But then consider what we also included in the equation. Look at the right side, for example, service delivery and access to cultural goods and services. An important component of our PDNA is the extent to which the affected communities are able to connect, as I think Stefan Simon said, and benefit from the cultural heritage. It doesn't matter whether a building has been destroyed or not. The question is, can the people use it, go there, practice their religious rituals, read their books, visit their museums, learn their language, practice their cultural traditions? This is an important consideration of PDNA, which has a strong relation to resilience, the capacity of a community to bounce back after an emergency and start the process of recovery. On the opposite side, we assess specifically the issue of governance and decision-making processes. We look in particular, are what happened to the local agencies, government infrastructure, institutions that normally are in charge of the culture sector, and how the disaster has affected their capacity to respond, to take decisions, to organize the recovery. And finally, at the bottom of this slide, we look in particular at new risks and new vulnerabilities created by the disaster, of which there are many for the culture sector. And we have learned this at our expense by working with many other sectors, for example, infrastructure and housing, who typically have very rapid plans for reconstruction, which can cause an additional damage to the cultural heritage. This was the case, for example, in the Caribbean, where a very important archaeological site was bulldozed to make room for a landing area for helicopters in the hours after the typhoon that hit the country last year. Now, after we have assessed the effects of a disaster on all of these aspects, some of these effects will have also an economic dimension. Not all of them, but some will definitely have it. And we categorize, not we at UNESCO, but the PDNA is built according to this conceptual framework. We categorize this into two different entities. One is called damage, and the other is called losses. Damage is the replacement cost of an asset that has been affected, destroyed partially or totally. So it's easier to understand. Losses, on the other hand, is a perhaps more difficult thing to understand, especially for people like me who come from a heritage background, but economists refer to this as the impact of a disaster on economic flows. It's not so much the cost of rebuilding the monument that has collapsed, but is the cost of, for example, setting up a scaffolding to prop it up so that it doesn't completely fall down. It's the cost for putting some security around the museum, because otherwise the collections could be looted. It's the cost, for example, for providing a temporary structure for the next 2 years so that the community can continue to worship and so on and so forth. So these are temporary costs. Typically diminished revenues. For example, no one will visit your museum, so no one will pay the ticket for an X number of years. And additional costs caused by the disaster. These losses have been typically neglected by the cultural heritage experts in the past, which only focused on the buildings, the things, and what it could take to repair, restore, reconstruct them. But experience shows that these losses are equally, if not more important, because they have a direct connection to the social and economic life of the affected community. Number of jobs lost, for example, for a certain period of time. So in short, there is an economic impact, but there is a human development impact, which has to do with the issue of access to culture, participation in cultural life, and what this means for the resilience of a community. An important element of PDNA is the planning of the recovery strategy. Again, here you will see from the column on the right that it is not just about restoring cultural heritage, objects or museums that have been affected, but it is about restoring services, assets, rebuilding the capacity of the authorities, building capacities through training, providing grants to people out of job during a certain period of time, so that they could continue their cultural lives, and this cultural diversity is not lost. And in rebuilding and in recovering, of course, we introduced the Build Back Better consideration, for example, through retrofitting or by stronger policy for disaster risk reduction. Culture, of course, is special. It's not just like any other sector. So when dealing with post-disaster needs assessment, we realize that sometimes a building or a structure has been damaged or destroyed, and it cannot be replaced. We cannot put a dollar figure against it and calculate, the economic value of its damage. In these situations, of course, the challenge of those working in culture is to understand what the loss of a certain asset has meant for the affected community and how we can address this issue in a sort of creative way. For example, by building a memorial, or for example, by setting up a special exhibition in a museum, or building a different but related structure that enables the continuity of a certain cultural practice that has been disrupted by the loss of a given cultural heritage asset. So this is an additional challenge that is specific to the cultural sector and which we have faced in conducting PDNAs in many countries. Now I come to the end of my presentation just to say that this PDNA, which we entered into simply because we felt that we couldn't be left out, every other agency was participating in these processes, we had to be there, but by learning this methodology, by practicing it, I think we have also discovered how this methodology provides new opportunities to the culture sector, to UNESCO and our partners. And I'm saying this because I feel that the focus on the people and on their social, economic well-being has led us to a redefinition of what cultural recovery and cultural resilience can mean. First of all, we have been able to demonstrate why culture is a key consideration in post-disaster recovery and reconstruction, because working with many other sectors at the same time, we were able to establish the connections and to demonstrate with obvious examples that culture was important for the affected communities. But we have also been able to, I think, see how this enlarged definition of culture, not just the physical assets, but the people, is critical in redefining what it means to be resilient from a cultural point of view. These are the two on the left are two important policy documents that have been adopted in recent years. One is the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, is the most important international policy that defines disaster risks, adopted in 2015 by the UN General Assembly. And the second is the, of course, 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So we have seen that if we wanted to really contribute to these policies, and if we wanted to carve a place for culture into these mechanisms and acquire legitimacy, we couldn't just go and assess cracks in walls and mosaic floors and objects that had been affected. We had to establish a clear connection between these things and what it meant for people in human development terms, and especially human rights and other human development indicators such as access, participation in cultural life, etc., etc. So the PDNA does this because it provides the lens that permits this sort of methodological shift. And it is also related to the third policy that I want to mention today, is the Warsaw Recommendation on Culture, on Recovery and Reconstruction of Cultural Heritage. This was adopted last July by the World Heritage Committee. It was the result of a conference held in Warsaw, and it was a declaration that discusses how cultural heritage sites destroyed by conflicts and disasters should be reconstructed. It was a response to an emerging need from the heritage community to redefine the parameters of reconstruction, considering that the guidance that was provided in the operational guidelines of the World Heritage Convention and in the existing doctrine was too rigid, too restrictive, too conservative, and inadequate to address the needs of today. The Warsaw recommendation, in a sense, marks a shift because it goes much further in recognizing that cultural heritage reconstruction goes beyond cultural consideration. It is an issue that has to do with the human rights of people. It goes beyond the liberation of experts, and it sort of places the core of resilience in the capacity of people to adapt to change and redefine their future, drawing on culture. An excessive emphasis on conservation of the past, in a sense, hampers their ability to respond. And in a sense, this shows that true cultural resilience sometimes means embracing change and being able to adapt to great transformations that we have to face anyway. Just today, I think the UN issued the new report on climate change. We all know that we will have to adjust. And so at UNESCO, it's dawning this sort of epiphany. It is true that perhaps we should use culture in the positive sense and not just as something that holds us back to paradigms that we will be unable to keep because the reality of the world makes it impossible. If we shift from conservation for its own sake to cultural adaptation, then perhaps our communities will be able to be truly resilient. And this is what, in a nutshell, the Warsaw Recommendation starts doing. And this is the last slide that I had prepared for you that sort of captures this overall message. I tried to link these two processes with a bit of an acrobacy. I hope you will forgive me. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.